At 10:23 in the morning on 13 October 1943, the German Type 7C submarine, German submarine U-27, moved slowly beneath the cold surface of the North Atlantic. The position lay roughly 600 nautical miles west of Ireland, along one of the busiest Allied convoy routes connecting North America to United Kingdom. Beneath a gray autumn sky, merchant ships crossed these waters daily, carrying fuel, ammunition, and food necessary to sustain Allied armies preparing for the invasion of Europe. Inside the steel hull, Captain Lieutenant Helmut Greger, commanding officer of U-427, stood beside the periscope in the narrow control room. The submarine measured 67 meters in length and displaced 769 tons on the surface. Two Germania-Werft F-46 diesel engines powered the vessel while surfaced. When submerged, electric motors drew energy from massive battery banks beneath the deck plates. At a depth of 50 meters, the submarine moved quietly at 3 knots. Greger had received orders 3 days earlier from Kriegsmarine Command to intercept convoys forming along the mid-Atlantic routes. German submarine strategy depended on isolating merchant shipping and forcing Britain into supply shortages. But by late 1943, the situation had changed. Allied convoys now traveled with heavy escort protection. Destroyers equipped with radar, HF-DF radio direction finding, and improved ASDIC sonar had turned the Atlantic into a deadly environment for submarines. At 10:26 in the morning, the quiet patrol ended. A sharp metallic pulse echoed through the hull. The sonar operator raised his voice. Active sonar contact, bearing 080. The sound came from an Allied escort vessel sweeping the convoy perimeter. On the surface above, the destroyer USS Schenck had begun a standard anti-submarine patrol pattern around convoy routes. The ship carried Mark 9 depth charges, each containing 200 pounds of Torpex explosive. When detonated underwater, the blast created pressure waves capable of crushing submarine hulls or disabling critical systems. Inside U-427, Captain Lieutenant Greger made a decision within seconds. Rig for silent running. Take the boat down to 100 meters. Valves opened. Seawater flooded ballast tanks. The submarine descended. At 10:31 in the morning, the sonar operator aboard USS Schenck detected a faint echo. Commander Franklin Johnson, commanding officer of the destroyer, ordered a standard attack pattern. Depth charges set for 100 feet and 200 feet. Crew members rolled the cylindrical explosives into stern racks while K gun launchers along the deck prepared to throw charges outward in a wide pattern. The goal was simple: force the submarine to surface or destroy it beneath the water. Below the waves, U-427 reached 110 meters depth. The crew shut down non-essential equipment. Electric motors slowed to 2 knots. Even small noises could betray the submarine position. At 10:38 in the morning, the first attack began. 6 depth charges entered the water in a staggered pattern. Seconds later, the ocean erupted. The first detonation slammed into the submarine hull like a giant hammer. The lights flickered. Dust fell from the interior piping. Pressure gauges trembled violently. Inside the engine room, crew members braced themselves against steel bulkheads as the shock waves traveled through the hull plating. The charges had detonated within 100 meters of the submarine, close enough to damage external components, but not close enough to kill the boat. Commander Johnson on USS Schenck studied the sonar readings. The echo remained. Target still submerged. Prepare second pattern. Above the water, additional escort vessels moved to assist. Among them were 2 British destroyers operating as convoy escorts. One was HMS Vedette, commanded by Commander Ralph Curry. The second was HMS Duncan, already experienced in submarine hunting operations. Within 20 minutes, 3 destroyers formed a coordinated search circle around the suspected submarine position. They would rotate attack runs to maintain continuous pressure. For a submarine commander, this was the worst possible situation, because the strategy was simple and brutally effective. Do not give the submarine time to escape. Continue explosions. Break the crew. Force mistakes. At 11:12 in the morning, another series of depth charges detonated closer. A pipe burst in the forward torpedo compartment. Seawater sprayed across the deck. Crew members rushed to tighten valves while electricians stabilized battery circuits. The hull groaned under increasing pressure, but Captain Lieutenant Greger remained calm. He ordered the submarine deeper. 150 meters, the submarine slowly descended into darker water where sonar reflections became less reliable. However, the Allied destroyers were adapting. Commander Curry aboard HMS Vedette adjusted the next attack pattern. Depth settings were increased. 250 feet, 300 feet. At 11:45 in the morning, the third wave of depth charges fell. The explosions were closer. One blast knocked a sailor unconscious in the control room. The magnetic compass lost calibration. Battery cells began leaking chlorine gas. And the attack had only just begun. Above the submarine, Allied destroyers had already prepared dozens more depth charges. They could continue for hours. Inside the dim control room, Captain Lieutenant Greger studied the depth gauge. The submarine now rested at 160 meters, dangerously close to the structural limits of the hull. The Type 7C design officially rated maximum safe depth at 230 meters. Every deeper maneuver increased the risk of catastrophic collapse. Gregor understood the reality. If the destroyers maintained constant attacks, the submarine batteries would eventually drain, air would become toxic, and the boat would be forced to surface directly beneath Allied guns. Outside the hull, the destroyers turned again for another run. More depth charges rolled toward the sea. The underwater war had begun, and the explosions would continue far longer than anyone expected. At 12:18 in the afternoon on 13 October 1943, the next wave of explosions struck the waters above German submarine U-427. The attack pattern came from HMS Vedette, which had just completed a sonar tracking run across the suspected submarine position. Commander Ralph Curry studied the ASDIC display in the dim sonar room. The signal was faint, but persistent. The submarine remained submerged at considerable depth. "Release pattern Bravo," Curry ordered. Behind the destroyer, crew members pushed Mark 7 depth charges into the stern racks. Each cylindrical charge weighed nearly 400 pounds, with a powerful Torpex explosive core designed to generate lethal pressure waves underwater. The charges entered the sea one by one. Inside U-427, the hydrophone operator counted the splashes. Then he whispered the words every submariner feared. "Charges entering water." Seconds later, the ocean detonated. 4 blasts erupted in rapid succession. The shock waves slammed into the submarine hull from multiple directions. The lights went dark for several seconds. Inside the forward compartment, a steel bracket snapped loose and crashed onto the deck plates. The submarine rolled slightly to port. Captain Lieutenant Helmut Gregor immediately issued new orders. "All stop. Maintain silent running." The electric motors fell silent. Without propeller noise, the submarine drifted slowly downward through the water column. Gregor understood the logic of the Allied attack pattern. Destroyers depended heavily on sonar reflections. When a submarine moved slowly or remained completely still, the sonar echo could become difficult to track. The submarine now rested at 170 meters. That depth pushed the structural limits of the Type 7C pressure hull. The steel plating was designed to withstand enormous external pressure, but repeated shock waves from nearby explosions could weaken rivets, valves, and seals. Inside the battery compartment, crew members monitored dangerous chemical reactions. Several battery cells had cracked during earlier explosions. A faint chlorine odor filled the air. If chlorine gas accumulated, it could incapacitate the crew within minutes. At 1:47 in the afternoon, the destroyer USS Schenck began another attack run. Commander Franklin Johnson had already released more than 30 depth charges since the first contact earlier that morning. Yet the submarine remained underwater. Johnson adjusted the new attack parameters. Depth settings 300 feet and 400 feet. The charges dropped. Inside the submarine, sailors braced themselves against bulkheads. The first explosion detonated extremely close. The hull flexed inward with a deep metallic groan. Several electrical circuits failed instantly. A red warning light illuminated the control panel. Minor leakage had begun in the aft torpedo room. Crew members rushed to reinforce the damaged seals, but the greatest threat was psychological. Depth charge attacks were designed not only to destroy submarines, but to exhaust and disorient their crews. Explosions arrived unpredictably. Minutes of silence would pass. Then another violent shock would slam the hull. Sleep became impossible. Concentration slowly eroded. Mistakes multiplied. At 3:10 in the afternoon, HMS Duncan joined the rotating attack pattern. 3 destroyers now took turns striking the same underwater target. The strategy ensured constant pressure. Whenever one ship completed an attack run, another vessel already approached with fresh sonar contact. Over the next several hours, the destroyers released dozens more depth charges. Underwater explosions echoed across miles of ocean. Inside U-427, the situation steadily worsened. Air quality declined, carbon dioxide levels increased. Several sailors began experiencing dizziness from the chlorine fumes. Engineers attempted emergency ventilation procedures while remaining submerged. Meanwhile, the submarine batteries drained steadily. The electric motors depended entirely on stored electrical power. Once the batteries were exhausted, the submarine would lose propulsion and internal lighting. To recharge the batteries, the submarine would need to surface and run diesel engines, but surfacing beneath 3 enemy destroyers would mean immediate destruction. At 6:35 in the evening, the submarine had been under attack for more than 8 hours. Yet the Allied commanders faced their own difficulties. Sonar signals had grown increasingly uncertain. Deep water layers in the North Atlantic created acoustic distortions. Temperature gradients bent sonar waves, causing echoes to drift or disappear entirely. Commander Curry aboard HMS Vedette studied the latest sonar readings. The submarine contact had weakened significantly, it might be drifting, or it might have slipped outside the search pattern. But abandoning the attack carried enormous risk. If the submarine escaped, it could return to hunt Allied convoys within days. Every merchant ship sunk meant lost fuel, ammunition, or food for Allied armies, preparing the future invasion of Western Europe. So the destroyers continued. At 8:12 in the evening, another depth charge pattern detonated above the submarine. Inside U-427, the crew now sat in near darkness. Battery power was critically low. Moisture dripped from overhead pipes. Temperature inside the submarine had risen above 30 degrees Celsius. Sweat covered the faces of exhausted sailors. Yet Captain Lieutenant Gregor refused to surface. Instead, he ordered the submarine even deeper, 200 meters. The depth gauge slowly descended. The pressure outside the hull increased to levels few submariners ever experienced. Steel plates creaked under immense force. The official crush depth of the Type 7C submarine remained classified within German naval engineering reports, but many commanders believed it was somewhere near 250 meters. Gregor had just moved dangerously close to that limit. Above the submarine, Allied destroyers prepared yet another attack run, but sonar operators were beginning to report something unexpected. The submarine echo had nearly vanished. Either the submarine was destroyed, or it had slipped into deeper water beyond reliable sonar range. At 9:55 in the evening, Commander Johnson aboard USS Schenck faced a difficult decision: continue searching blindly, or withdraw and rejoin convoy escort duty. Below the destroyers, U-427 drifted silently at extreme depth. The crew waited without speaking. Battery levels were nearly exhausted. Air quality was deteriorating, and if the destroyers made one more accurate attack run, the submarine hull might not survive the pressure. Above them, the ships turned once again. The hunt was not finished, but neither side knew how much longer the submarine could endure. At 10:32 in the evening on 13 October 1943, the exhausted crew of German submarine U-427 remained silent in near total darkness. The submarine rested at approximately 200 meters depth in the cold North Atlantic. Outside the pressure hull, the ocean exerted enormous force. At that depth, the surrounding water pressed against the steel plating with more than 20 atmospheres of pressure. Inside the boat, conditions had deteriorated badly. Battery reserves were almost depleted. Air quality had declined to dangerous levels. Chlorine fumes from damaged battery cells still lingered faintly in the compartments. Sweat and condensation coated every surface. Several crew members had been awake for more than 16 continuous hours. Captain Lieutenant Helmut Gregor remained beside the central control panel. His situation was brutally simple. If the submarine surfaced too soon, the destroyers above would detect it instantly by radar or visual lookout. If the submarine remained submerged much longer, the batteries would die and the crew would slowly suffocate. Above the submarine, the Allied destroyers had now been hunting for nearly 12 hours. The three vessels involved in the operation were USS Schenck, HMS Vedette, and HMS Duncan. Together, they had already released well over 100 depth charges into the ocean. Yet the submarine had not surfaced. The destroyer crews were beginning to face their own operational constraints. Depth charge stocks were running low. Fuel consumption during constant maneuvering had increased significantly, and the convoy escort mission could not be abandoned indefinitely. At 11:15 in the evening, sonar operators aboard HMS Vedette reported an uncertain contact. The signal was extremely weak. Commander Ralph Curry studied the acoustic trace. The submarine echo appeared deeper than before, possibly below 200 meters. At such depths, sonar reflections often became distorted by temperature layers and ocean currents. Curry made the decision to conduct one final attack run. Prepare depth charges for 400 feet. Crew members loaded the remaining charges into stern racks and K-gun launchers. Minutes later, the destroyer passed directly over the suspected submarine position. 6 charges entered the water. Inside U-427, the hydrophone operator whispered the warning, "Charges entering water." Several crew members closed their eyes. The explosions came seconds later, but this time the detonations sounded distant. The shockwaves rippled through the water without striking the hull directly. The destroyers had missed. It was the first major error in the Allied attack pattern since the hunt began that morning. Below the ships, Captain Lieutenant Gregor recognized the opportunity immediately. The submarine batteries now held only a small reserve of power, but the destroyers were beginning to lose precise sonar contact. Gregor issued a quiet command. "Electric motors slow ahead, course southwest." The submarine began moving again for the first time in nearly an hour. At 2 knots, the vessel crept slowly away from the search area. Movement carried risk, but remaining stationary guaranteed eventual suffocation. The submarine gradually descended another 10 meters, reaching approximately 210 meters depth. The pressure hull creaked under the immense external force, but the maneuver achieved a critical advantage. The deeper position placed the submarine beneath a complex thermocline layer. In the North Atlantic, colder dense water often lay beneath slightly warmer layers above. Sonar waves passing through this boundary could bend unpredictably. The thermocline created a natural acoustic shield. Above the submarine, the destroyers continued scanning. At 11:48 in the evening, sonar aboard USS Schenck briefly detected a faint echo. Commander Franklin Johnson ordered another sweep. But the signal faded quickly. The submarine had slipped deeper into the thermocline layer. Without a reliable sonar track, depth charge attacks became guesswork. The destroyers executed several additional search passes, but each sweep produced weaker signals. Eventually, the ocean returned only empty echoes. Below the thermocline, U-427 continued its slow escape. Inside the submarine, the crew remained silent. Battery power dropped steadily. At 1:14 in the morning on 14 October, Gregor studied the battery gauge. The remaining charge would last less than 1 hour. The submarine had moved several nautical miles away from the original attack area, but the surface still carried enormous risk. Allied destroyers could still patrol nearby. Gregor waited until the final possible moment. At 1:52 in the morning, after more than 15 hours submerged, he gave the order. "Prepare to surface." Compressed air forced water from the ballast tanks. The submarine began its slow ascent. Crew members listened carefully for propeller noise from nearby ships. None appeared. At 1:57 in the morning, the submarine broke the surface of the Atlantic. Fresh air rushed through opened hatches. Diesel engines started moments later. The batteries immediately began recharging. Lookouts scanned the dark horizon. No destroyers appeared. The Allied ships had already withdrawn hours earlier to rejoin their convoy escort duties. Against extraordinary odds, U-427 had survived one of the longest sustained depth charge attacks of the Atlantic War. More than 100 depth charges had detonated around the submarine. Critical systems had been damaged. Air had nearly become unbreathable. The hull had endured pressures close to its structural limit. Yet the submarine had escaped. For the German submarine force, the survival demonstrated the resilience of the Type 7C design and the discipline required of trained submarine crews. For the Allies, the encounter revealed a growing challenge. Even with advanced sonar, coordinated destroyer groups, and large depth charge arsenals, a skilled submarine commander could still disappear into the vast Atlantic. But the strategic balance in the Battle of the Atlantic was already shifting. Improved radar, escort carriers, and long-range patrol aircraft would soon tighten the net around the remaining German submarines. The survival of U-427 on that October night did not change the course of the war. Yet for 15 hours beneath the Atlantic, the crew had endured a contest of engineering limits, tactical patience, and human endurance, and the ocean had chosen not to claim them.